Hey guys, Dirty H here and welcome back to episode 8 of San Francisco. Well, it's fair to say that the city's definitely looking like something now. It's definitely starting to come together. Some of these places I've built are looking really sweet and I've spent a lot of time trying to get things to look right. Well, in this episode we're going to focus more on the actual game mechanics and try and meet some of the needs of the citizens, and namely we're going to expand the industry area. I want to do something a little bit different with my industries area in this series. In pretty much every other series I've ever done, I've just jammed all my industry down at the port and just really called that my industry area without any real proper thought to it. Well, I'm going to do things a little bit differently here. I've never really played around with the Industries DLC that much, and it's a fantastic DLC. It's probably one of the, if not the best one that's come out. And there is a ton of money to be made if you set them up properly. So let's chuck in a couple of industry areas, and we'll start here with a forestry area. There's this really hilly area right next to the industry that I've already put in that I was sort of umming and ahhing about what to put in, and it sort of makes sense to make it into a forest. It's really steep and probably not really that suitable for building on. So a forestry or a forested area here would sort of make sense. Now I'm a little bit ashamed to admit it, but most of this was new to me, putting down these forestry buildings and figuring out how to lay out the district properly and stuff like that. And now that I've done this, it's really simple, but at the time, looking back at this now, yeah, I struggled a little wee bit with figuring it all out. But basically for any given industry, there's a handful of buildings that you have to put down, and there seems to be a handful of buildings that you can put down to up production or make things more efficient. So in terms of my layout here, I've used like a gravel forestry sort of a road to go around most of the plots, and then eventually I'll upgrade the main road running through here to tarmac because we get a fair bit of traffic. So that forestry area ended up being really simple to put in, and I'm not planning on doing any detail there whatsoever. So the next thing to do is I want to run some of these connections. These are railway connections off and up further up the peninsula. This is because we are going to install an oil area further up that peninsula. And I want all of these lines to be as efficient as I can possibly get them, so that I'm hooking them up to all of the appropriate places. One of them runs directly to the trade port, which runs exports out of town, and the other line just runs back into the main line to the north, and it's also got a connection to the south. So I really do want this to be as efficient as possible. As for the trucks and the road traffic, I'm putting this road here that's going to connect back into the 280 intersection, and this is going to help traffic flow directly out of this oil area and onto the highway if they need to go in that direction. Originally I was going to make a whole new connection off the highway for this industrial area, but with this intersection so close, it sort of made sense to plumb the traffic over and into that because it's being underutilized at the moment as well. It's this huge hulking intersection with not much traffic going through it, because I really followed the real life blueprint with this intersection, and I guess it will get busy as we build in the city, but there's so many connections into it at the moment that aren't being utilised, and I just have to modify it a little wee bit here to get this plumbed in, and then all of this traffic out of this industry area, or the oil area in particular, can just flow directly out and go wherever it needs to from here. And I'm quietly excited to see how these areas work, because like I mentioned earlier, I've never really followed the industry's blueprint properly and used these areas like they should. For instance, once we start making oil here, we can make petroleum, and then petroleum can make other products like shoes and all sorts of stuff, which is what I'm planning on doing later in the series. But I really love the idea of linking them all together and also making these particular areas look as realistic as we can. $2.20's new Mile Bay series is a really good example of being able to build a realistic looking city and following the game mechanics or what the game needs. So there's definitely been inspiration from what $2.20's doing there. and it's actually quite funny to see him struggle at times with basic game mechanics when he's like this master builder. And yeah, I can definitely relate to his pain, because there's basic things in this game that I've really just not really paid too much attention to for one reason or another, and it's nice to see the likes of Mile Bay type series to remind us that there is a game to be played. I finish off the forestry area by zoning out some of the area below or directly below this intersection, and then just putting in various random industry. You may notice that I've actually got some zoning up at the top of the screen, and there's no real reason for this. It's a little bit experimental, but I haven't actually put any zoning down for like 3 years, so it felt really weird to do that. But to finish off the forestry area, I just put down a few dirt patches below some of the trees just to make it look a little bit more realistic, and then I put a few scrubby patches of trees here and there, but predominantly next to the highway. So now our forestry area is complete. We've laid the groundwork for the next area, so let's move on to our oil industry. I'm not entirely sure why, but I've decided to put the oil industry out here on this point. And when I say oil industry, it's pretty much exactly what we've done with the forestry, but with oil. And that includes a main building for the workers and various buildings to make everything run more efficiently and more smoothly. And I guess all I'm really doing is laying these buildings out on a pretty fancy looking dock that I make here. The end of the train line is also going to terminate at another harbour, which connects directly to the other harbour we put in episode 3, and also to the north and south like I mentioned earlier. We also have our connections back onto the highway we done earlier, and I also run a coastal road that sort of runs back out and through northwards. These roads that you can see me setting out here are just so obviously there's access to the various buildings, because we're going to have real workers coming out here. And it was probably worth mentioning too that I've put in a train station for passengers also back just at the beginning of this oil area, so hopefully we get lots of people coming to work on the train rather than bringing their cars. So I plumb up a double harbour here, and then spend a bit of time putting some nice dock edging around this harbour and sort of blending it in with what I've built here. Once the harbour's in place, I spend a little bit of time jiggling the roads around and the tracks and getting them as good as I can. Then I can move on to filling the area out with buildings and creating some jobs. Now we're set to get all of our buildings in place. So the first thing I do is put the main building down, which allows us to paint the district in the shape that we need. Then I move on to putting some oil pumps in, and admittedly I put these right here in the port, which is probably a really silly idea. I should have put these over on the hills or moved them to a different site, so looking back at this I may change this, but for now they're going right here in this port. The next buildings I want to put right out as far as I can get on this other little point here that we made, and I put a few of these buildings in off camera as well because they ended up being quite fiddly, or more fiddly than I thought they would be. But once I had all of those in place, I decided I wanted to detail this a little bit more with a few decals and just a handful of props here and there. We didn't use any in the forestry area because it's really not anywhere near as visible as this oil area, and again being right on the coast here, and yeah, it already looks pretty cool, so I think we can spruce it up a little bit more with a handful of props. So to finish off the last bit of the coast here, I just add some really thick bush and scrub and a few trees to this hilly area here, and this sort of looks like an extension of the forestry area, and I've run these trees right up to the edge of the oil industry, and this gives a really cool contrast. I think this looks quite neat. I also run a road up the coast here and detail the coast a little wee bit with a few rocks and stuff, and I might come back and build something different in this area later on, but for now this looks pretty cool, I think, in between these two industry areas. I definitely like the idea of it looking a little bit untamed and sort of full on natural and that sort of thing, and that's pretty much it for the outside coast here of these areas. And the very last bit to do is the inside coast, where it turns around and goes southwards, and you'll get a good view of the passenger train station that I was talking about earlier. I've tried to place it in a place where it could service both workers at both industry areas, so hopefully it gets a lot of use later on. And as we come around the inside of the bay, I wanted to leave this as an empty space with just a few building lots that are maybe under development on them. So when we look on Google Earth, we can see there's lots of these lots around San Francisco, and they definitely look like they're in the midst of some form of planning for construction, or maybe they're being used as a site to dump material, but that's how I look to detail the inside of this bay. So now we can move on to the second part of this episode, and I've put so much industry in now that we are short of workers, and I end up putting in a massive neighborhood here. This is easily the most building I've ever accomplished in one episode of any series I've ever done. So we are going to aim to build in between these two highways. This whole area is going to be built out. So the first thing I do is put a grid pattern in with these roads. They're running on the same angle as the bottom highway, and I've tried to create a gap in the pattern so that I can put a high school and a college in here, because as it stands at the moment I have no university in the city and a very makeshift high school, so I'm looking forward to building this area. The first thing I do is put down a high school, and yes, I'm just using the vanilla high school. I don't mind. It's not a bad looking building, and it does very much look like an American high school. I just try and change the colour a little wee bit, and I guess you could say this is going to be more of an education zone. There's going to be a small kindergarten here as well, or sorry, an elementary school is probably what it's known as elsewhere. But there's also going to be things like a community pool and sort of like baseball park areas and stuff like that. I also use the vanilla university here, but I use a couple of PO buildings and sort of hide it because it's not the greatest looking building, and I'm not going to dive into the workshop just to get a university building when I can just use PO and make it look like pretty much anything I want to. We are also going to have more than one high school. There's going to be about 5 or 6 spread over the Bay Area by the time we've finished the series, so I'm not going to get cute and precious about one of them. They will, however, all be unique from each other in one way or another. So whilst I was having a look around on Google Earth at the different high schools in the area, I noticed one particular theme, and that was they all sort of had their own fields or sporting complexes. So I'm definitely going to look to do that here. And unfortunately this field is scaled probably a little bit on the small side, but I'm not worried about it because most of the stuff in the city is scaled incorrectly anyway, so it looks pretty good sitting in here, and that's enough. We also put the community pool in I mentioned earlier, and a little basketball court area. And details wise, it's pretty much just trees to give a bit of shade and keep the temperature down. There's a couple of ugly car parks that have had to be put in here. I've also made a point to put like paved areas out the front of the high schools and the universities. And I changed the main road running through here to a tram road to create another loop and put a few stops in as well. Some of the last details include a few skid mark decals around the car parks, and I put like a wooden pergola over the community pool for a bit of shade. So believe it or not, this is actually the first time I've put tram lines in the city. We've got plenty of bus routes in the city thanks to the massive transit hub we built in episode 4, I think it was. But for whatever reason, the trams have waited all the way until now. And I'm pretty sure the rail system in San Francisco is called BART, or Bay Area Rail Transit. I'm pretty sure it is. I know there's Muni as well, but I don't know as much about these systems as I should. And there's a good chance I'm going to end up changing these lines in future. So they're just one big loop at the moment, but I think in future we're going to have a point-to-point line with turntables or turnstiles, whatever you call them, on the ends of the line. So we've got our lines in now and we are ready to proceed and put these buildings in, and I wanted to get those lines in first so that they're sort of available and active straight away for these citizens when they move in. In terms of the housing over here, it's a little bit different from the residential we've put down in the past. These ones seem to have a little bit more room and have a bit of a backyard, so they're very much wall to wall still, so we're going to look to do that, but they got a slightly bigger backyard. There is also the odd building that isn't wall to wall, or the odd residential that isn't wall to wall, so you will see a few freestanding single dwellings as well. You can also see there's like a collector road here as well near the high school, and that one has got a bit of low commercial on it to service this neighbourhood. And after what felt like placing 1,000 houses, we can scoop in a little bit closer and detail it up. And around this first intersection, it's just scrubby bush, a bit of a retaining wall, nothing fancy here. Obviously nothing's going to be built in the middle of this intersection, and as we move northwards I put in a couple of car parks and then just a few trees in between the train tracks in the back of these houses just to buffer the sound a bit. And in terms of the rest of the neighbourhood, it's just those trees in the backyard that we spoke about earlier and not too much else really, but it looks really good when it's done. Thanks to our industry areas, San Francisco is finally making some money. It might only be $54, but hey, we're in the green. I hope you guys have enjoyed this monstrous episode. You can see how much we've got done. I'm going to try and keep this up for the future. If you like it, give it a thumbs up. I'd appreciate it. And I will see you guys in the next episode of San Francisco. Look after yourselves, guys. See you later.